There are moments in a man's life that last only a few seconds, but end up defining everything that comes after. Not the loud moments, not the ones with gunfire and shouting and dust kicked up by running horses. The quiet ones. The ones where a man looks at a stranger in need and has to decide, fast and without anyone watching, exactly what kind of person he has chosen to be. Most men in the Arizona territory of the 1880s had a simple answer to that question when the stranger was Apache. They kept riding. They turned their eyes to the trail ahead and told themselves it was not their problem, that the land was dangerous enough without borrowing trouble, that a man alone had to think about himself first. Cal Reardon had told himself the same thing more than once. He had lived by that rule for 3 years on a stretch of dry rangeland south of Prescott, and it had served him well enough. He had kept his cattle, kept his water, and kept his skin intact, while half the men who had settled near him had either sold out and gone back east, or ended up buried in rocky ground with a wooden marker that the sun would bleach and the wind would eventually knock flat. But the afternoon he came around the base of the red sandstone bluff and saw the girl running. Everything he thought he knew about keeping to himself ran straight into something it could not get around. She was young, maybe 17 or 18, wearing a torn deerskin dress with her long black hair plastered to her face by sweat and dust. She was running hard, her bare feet hitting the cracked earth in a desperate rhythm, and she was looking back over her shoulder at something that had not appeared yet, but was coming fast. Cal heard it before he saw it, the drumming of hooves. 3 riders cresting the bluff behind her, close enough that he could already make out the glint of rifle barrels and the hard set of their faces. Bounty men. He had seen their kind before, men who collected money for Apache scalps from ranchers and mining companies who had decided that the territory would run cleaner without the people who had lived there first. They were not lawmen. They had no badges, no warrants, and no interest in anything that resembled mercy. The girl had maybe 200 yards on them, and those yards were shrinking with every heartbeat. Cal sat still on his horse for a moment, his hand loose on the reins. The animal beneath him shifted, reading the tension in his legs. He looked at the riders. He looked at the girl. He did not think long. He never could explain afterward exactly why, only that something in the way she ran, not panicked and frantic but fast and purposeful and still fighting, reminded him of his younger sister back in Missouri, and that image arrived in his chest before any sensible reasoning could stop it. He put his heels to the horse and rode hard toward her, cutting the angle between them. When he reached her, she spun to face him with something sharp in her hand, a broken piece of flint gripped like a blade, her dark eyes burning with a fire that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the refusal to go down without a cost. He pulled up and swung out of the saddle in one motion, dropping to the ground and holding the reins out to her. He did not say anything that she would understand. He just held out the horse and stepped back. She stared at him. The hoofbeats behind her were getting louder. For 2 full seconds she did not move, and Cal understood that she was calculating, reading him the way a person reads country they have never crossed before, looking for the trap in it. Then she grabbed the reins, vaulted onto the horse with a grace that would have been something to admire under any other circumstance, and she was gone. The horse kicked up a spray of red dirt and vanished around the southern face of the bluff. Cal turned around and stood in the open. The 3 riders came up hard and pulled their horses to a stop a dozen feet from him, their animals blowing and stamping. The man in front was thick through the chest with a short red beard and eyes that had the flat look of someone who had stopped asking certain questions about his own work a long time ago. He looked at Cal standing there on foot in the middle of nowhere, and then looked at the empty land where the horse had been. "You just gave your horse to an Apache girl," the man said. It was not quite a question. Cal put his thumbs in his belt. She needed it more than I did. The red-bearded man leaned forward in his saddle and studied him for a long moment with an expression that moved between disbelief and something darker. "That horse worth $20, another rider said. "Probably more." Cal said nothing. The red-bearded man let out a slow breath through his nose. "You just made yourself real poor and real stupid in the space of about 10 seconds, friend." Cal looked at him steady. "I have been both before." They sat there a moment longer, the horses shifting and the hot wind pushing grit through the air between them. Then, without another word, the red-bearded man wheeled his horse, and the three riders moved off to the south, though not at any great speed, and Cal watched them go with a feeling in his gut that he had not seen the last of that particular problem. He walked back to his ranch. It took him nearly 2 hours in the afternoon heat, and by the time the low wooden buildings came into view against the fading sky, his boots were full of dust and his shirt was soaked through. His ranch hand, a quiet man named Doyle, who had been with him since the first season, was sitting on the porch with a coffee cup and a look on his face that moved from concern to confusion when he saw Cal coming in on foot. Doyle did not ask right away. He went inside and came back with another cup and set it on the rail, and they both looked out at the corral where Cal's second horse, a steady old mare, stood watching them with patient eyes. After a while, Doyle said, "Where's the roan?" Cal told him what had happened. Doyle was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Those bounty men are going to come back here." Cal said, "I know, and you still did it." Cal drank his coffee. "She was running for her life, Doyle. A man doesn't just sit on a horse and watch that." Doyle looked at the desert going purple in the dusk and said nothing more about it. He was not the kind of man who argued past a certain point, and he recognized the particular quality of stillness in Cal that meant the decision was made and buried and was not coming back up for discussion. They had a quiet supper, and Cal spent the evening checking his rifle and his ammunition without making a ceremony of it, simply going through the motions the way a man prepares for weather he has been reading in the sky all day. If you're riding with this story so far, go ahead and leave a like on the video. It tells us to keep bringing you more tales like this one, and it means more than you know. The days that followed had a particular kind of weight to them. Cal worked his land and tended his remaining horse and repaired a section of fence that the dry season had been working loose for weeks. And all the while he was aware of the horizon, the way a person is aware of a sound they cannot quite place. Always there at the edge of attention, never quite arriving. He did not sleep fully for the first 3 nights. He lay in the dark with the rifle within reach and listened to the coyotes and the wind and the occasional restless movement of the mare in the corral. On the 4th morning he was out early checking the fence line along the northern edge of his property when Doyle came riding hard from the direction of the ranch, and the look on his face was enough to bring Cal out of the saddle before the man had even opened his mouth. "Something came," Doyle said, breathing from the ride. "Better come see." They came back to the ranch at a trot, and what Cal saw when he rounded the corner of the barn stopped him still. Standing in his corral alongside the old mare was the roan. His roan, the same animal he had handed to the girl 4 days ago, healthy and groomed, its mane braided with a strip of red cloth that had not been there before. He stepped forward slowly and put his hand on the horse's neck and felt the warmth of it and checked it over with the careful attention of a man who knows his animals. And he found not a mark on it, not a stone bruise or a wire cut or any sign of hard use. Someone had taken good care of that horse. He stood there for a moment with his hand resting on the roan's shoulder while the mare nudged at him from the other side, and he tried to sort through the feeling that was moving through him, which was not quite relief and not quite surprise, but something more complicated than either. Doyle appeared at his shoulder. "That's not all," he said. He pointed toward the base of the fence post at the far end of the corral. Tied to the post was a bundle wrapped in dark cloth. Cal walked over and crouched down and opened it with careful hands. Inside was a piece of worked leather, a wide band tooled with a pattern of interlocking shapes that he did not know the meaning of, but which was clearly the work of many careful hours. With it was a small pouch of dried herbs tied with a twist of sinew, the kind his late wife had once told him Apache healers used for drawing fever. And beneath that, a single eagle feather, the shaft wrapped in copper wire. He stayed crouched for a long moment, turning the leather piece over in his hands. Then he stood up and looked out at the country beyond his fence, the flat expanse of red rock and sparse brush stretching away to the distant bluffs. And he had the distinct feeling of being watched, not with menace but with something more like attention, the way you might watch a man you are trying to understand. "Nobody's out there that I can see," Doyle said from behind him. "That doesn't mean much," Cal answered. He hung the leather piece on the post inside his door and put the herb pouch on the shelf where he kept his medicines and set the feather on the table where it would catch the morning light. He did not tell anyone in town about what had happened. He was not a man who told stories about himself. And beyond that, he understood with a plainness that needed no discussion that some gifts arrive with a kind of privacy attached to them, an understanding that they are between certain people and not meant for the general noise of human conversation. The red-bearded man came back on the 5th day, as Cal had expected. He came with only one of the other riders this time, and he came during the middle of the day when the sun was at its harshest and the ground shimmered and everything at a distance looked like it might be dissolving. Cal was working at the water trough when they rode up, and he set down his tools and stood and waited without hurrying toward anything. The red-bearded man looked at the corral and saw the roan, and his expression shifted in a way that Cal found interesting, a mix of recognition and something that might have been unease. "He got his horse back," one of the riders said to the other, as if Cal were not present to hear it. Cal crossed his arms. "Something I can help you with?" The red-bearded man leaned on his saddle horn. "Word around is you and some Apache are on friendly terms." He made the last 2 words sound like an accusation. Cal looked at him without expression. "I gave a girl a horse when she needed one. She gave it back." He shrugged. "That's the whole of it." The man narrowed his eyes. "There's a bounty on Apache in this territory. You interfering with that bounty makes you part of the problem." Cal looked at the man for a long, quiet moment and then said, "I've heard a lot of things called a problem in my life. A person running for their life doesn't make that list." The red-bearded man's jaw tightened. "You think those Apache friends of yours are going to be there when the trouble comes? They won't protect you," Cal said. "I'm not asking anyone to protect me." Then he picked up his tools and went back to work on the water trough, and the 2 men sat on their horses for a while longer, in that way people do when they want to seem like they are deciding something, and then they rode away. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. There's a lot more of the frontier waiting for you, and we're just getting to the heart of this one. What Cal did not know, and would not know for several more days, was that the encounter with those 3 riders in the desert had been seen, not just by him and by the girl. The country around that part of Arizona had eyes in it that most settlers never noticed, not because they were careless exactly, but because they were looking at the land the way newcomers always do, for what they can use from it rather than what it might be saying. The Apache had been watching that corridor of land between the bluffs and the dry creek bed for generations, and they watched it still, even as the territory filled with men who believed watching was something only the hunted did. The girl who had taken Cal's horse was named Saya, and she was the younger daughter of a man named Kuruk, who led a small band that had been moving carefully through that part of the territory for 2 seasons, staying away from the army posts and the mining camps and the scattered ranches that were spreading across the land like water finding low ground. Kuruk was not a man given to quick judgments. He had lived long enough to have learned that quick judgments were often the ones you paid for most dearly. When Saya came back to camp on the roan horse and told him what had happened, he had listened without interrupting, The way he always listened, with his full attention resting on his daughter's words, and his eyes reading her face for the things words did not say. She described the man in the way she had experienced him. The steadiness in his eyes when he stepped down from the horse. The absence of calculation. The fact that he had stepped back to give her room rather than forward to assert something. Kuruk had heard many descriptions of many white men over the years, and most of those descriptions had certain qualities in common. This one was different in a way he found worth considering. He said nothing for a while after she finished. Then he sent 2 of his most trusted men with the horse and the things he had chosen to send with it. Things that had specific meanings within his people's understanding of obligation and respect. And he told them to leave them at the ranch and come back and tell him what they saw of the place and the man. What they reported back was a ranch that looked like work, not like money, the kind of difference that tells a man something. No signs of the particular kind of carelessness that came from arrogance, no broken things left broken for lack of caring, no waste. A single ranch hand who moved like he knew the land, and the man himself, who had accepted what they left with a stillness that suggested he understood at some level that it was not ordinary. Kuruk thought about it for 3 days. Then he made a decision that surprised some of the younger men in his band, and did not surprise at all those who had been with him long enough to know how he thought. The morning the Apache appeared at Cal's ranch was not frightening in the way he had half prepared himself for it to be. He was inside making coffee when Doyle knocked on the doorframe and said quietly, "You need to come outside." And the tone of his voice was careful rather than alarmed. Cal set down his coffee and walked out. There were 7 of them on horseback at the edge of his property, just beyond the fence line. They were not arranged in any threatening way, no weapons drawn, no display of numbers meant to intimidate. They were simply there, present in the early morning light, and among them Cal recognized the roan horse with his braid still in its mane, and on the roan he saw the girl. She was sitting straight and calm and watching him with those dark, serious eyes. And next to her was an older man whose bearing carried the kind of unhurried weight that Cal associated with people who had spent a lifetime making decisions that other people's lives depended on. He walked toward them slowly and stopped at the fence and waited, because it seemed like the right thing to do. The older man spoke something in his own language, and the girl translated in the careful English that she had been taught by a missionary 2 years before, and had practiced in secret ever since, finding it useful in ways she had not expected. "My father says you gave your horse to someone who needed it, and you asked nothing in return, and when you were threatened for it, you did not change what you had done." Cal nodded slowly. The girl went on. "He says that is a kind of behavior his people have a word for. It does not translate easily. It means something like acting rightly when there is no witness and no reward. He says it is rare in any person. He says he wants to know if you are like that in all things or only sometimes." Cal thought about that for a moment. He looked at the older man, and then at the girl, and then back at the older man. He said, "I try to be. I don't always manage it. But I try." The girl translated, and the older man was quiet for a moment, and then said something brief. She said, "He says that is the only honest answer, and that honest answers are also rare." Then there was a pause, and she said, "He wants to know if your water is good." Cal almost smiled. "It comes from a spring," he said. "It hasn't gone dry in 3 years." She translated, and the man nodded once. Then he dismounted, which was not something Cal had expected, and walked to the fence and waited. Cal unlatched the gate and opened it. They sat on the porch, Cal and the older man, while the girl moved between them as a bridge of language. Doyle made more coffee and brought it out without ceremony, handing cups around with the quiet competence that Cal had always valued in him, the ability to treat an unusual thing as if it were ordinary. The man's name was Kuruk. He had led his band through this part of the territory for years, finding the spaces between the army patrols and the mining companies and the settlers, keeping his people moving and fed and relatively whole in a world that was contracting around them with a steadiness that he did not pretend to himself was anything other than what it was. He had learned when to be invisible and when visibility was more useful. He had learned the difference between white men who feared his people and white men who hated them, and white men who simply did not know what to think. He said he had met very few of the last kind who were also willing to act before they had finished thinking. Cal listened to all of this through the translation of his daughter and said very little, because there was not much to say, and because the morning had a quality to it that he did not want to disturb with unnecessary words. What they talked about most in the end was practical. Water and the movement of certain groups of riders through the territory and the locations of water sources that Cal did not know about, and the quality of the grazing on the northern part of his range. They talked about the red-bearded man and the two riders with him, and Kuruk confirmed what Cal had already suspected, that those men were known, that they had been responsible for things Cal was not going to ask him to detail, and that they would be back. This is the part of the story where most people think they know what comes next. They imagine that what formed between these two men was a formal alliance, an agreement written in handshakes and promises, a transaction of mutual benefit carefully measured out like goods at a store counter. But it was not like that. What formed was quieter and more durable than any agreement. It was the particular understanding that develops between people who have each recognized something in the other that they did not expect to find, and who are both honest enough to let that recognition stand without trying to make it into something it is not. Kuruk left with his people before noon, and he left behind nothing that could be counted or measured, no signed paper, no formal words. What he left was simply the knowledge on both sides that something had shifted, that the land between Kuruk's territory and Cal's ranch had a different quality to it now, a kind of permission running through it that had not been there the week before. Don't forget to comment below. Would you have given that horse away? We want to know what you would have done in Cal's place. The red-bearded man came back 2 weeks later, and this time he came with 6 riders instead of 2. And this time he came at dusk when the light was difficult and the terrain worked against a man trying to see clearly at a distance. Cal heard them coming from the water trough, where he was finishing the evening routine, and he walked to the porch and stood there and watched them approach with the Winchester in his hand and his heart doing the thing it always did before trouble, which was to go very quiet and very steady, as if it had decided to be useful. They came through the fence without stopping, which was the first thing, and they fanned out as they came, which was the second thing, and Cal understood that this was not a visit with any element of conversation left in it. He said nothing. He raised the rifle and put the red-bearded man's chest in the sight and said, "That's as far as you come." The man pulled his horse up and held it there, the animal dancing under him in the bad light. Behind the red-bearded man, 2 of the riders had begun to move to Cal's left, angling toward the blind side of the barn. Cal tracked them with the rifle and they stopped. He was one man with a rifle and there were 6 of them, and everyone present understood the arithmetic. What happened next was something Cal would spend a long time afterward trying to describe to Doyle and never quite finding the right words for. From the darkness beyond the northern fence, a sound came. It was not a shout or a signal, not anything that could be called dramatic. It was a low whistle that rose and then dropped, and then it was answered from the east, and then from somewhere on the slope behind the barn. The horses among the 6 riders began to react before the men did, heads coming up, ears swiveling. That animal knowledge of being surrounded working faster than human reasoning. One of the horses turned sideways and refused to move forward, and when the rider pushed it, it stepped backward instead. The red-bearded man looked around him at the darkening desert, and for the first time since Cal had met him, he saw something in the man's face that he recognized from other situations, which was the particular quality of stillness that arrives when a person realizes the numbers are not what they thought. 3 more whistles came from different directions. Cal lowered his rifle slightly and said in a conversational tone, "I think you should leave now." The man on the turning horse had already broken and was riding for the fence. The others watched him go, and then 2 more followed, and then the rest, and the red-bearded man was the last to go, and he went without looking back. Cal stood on his porch until the sound of them was gone. Then he stood a while longer in the silence that followed. After a time, a sound came from the darkness near the fence line, a single soft call, and Cal raised a hand toward it, toward the unseen presence in the dark country beyond his property, and he held his hand up for a moment and then let it drop. He went inside and set the rifle on the table and sat down. Doyle appeared in the doorway from the back room where he had been waiting with his own gun. "That was Apache out there," he said. Cal said, "Yes." Doyle sat down across from him and was quiet. After a while, he said, "They watched over the place." Cal said, "It appears so." They sat in the quiet for a long time after that, the lamp flame barely moving in the still air of the cabin, the desert dark and vast beyond the windows. And Cal thought about the girl running across the cracked earth with her feet bare and her jaw set, and about the moment he stepped down from that horse without knowing what would come of it, and about the strange arithmetic of the frontier that said a man acting rightly in a small moment in an empty place could find himself held by something larger than he had any reason to expect. The red-bearded man was not seen in that part of the territory again. Whether he moved on to easier ground or was persuaded to in some way that Cal never learned, the result was the same. The following spring was the wettest in 3 years, and Cal's water ran good, and his cattle came through the season better than they had since his first year on the land. He hired 2 more hands and fixed the north fence properly and dug a secondary water tank on the far pasture. Saya came to the ranch twice more that year, once with 2 other women from the band who had heard about the spring and wanted to see it, and once alone, carrying a second braided leather piece smaller than the first, which Cal understood was meant for the horse rather than for him. He put it on the roan's bridle, and when people in town asked about it, which they did, because men in small places notice everything, he said only that he had gotten it in trade. He did not explain the trade. Some things carry their meaning precisely in their not being explained, in the space between what happened and what gets said about it, which is where a man lives in relation to the truest parts of his own story. He kept the feather on his table until the day he sold the ranch, which was many years later, and when he packed his few belongings, the feather came with him. There is a version of the frontier that has been told many times and in many forms, the version where the land belongs to those strong enough to take and hold it, where kindness is weakness and distance is safety, and every stranger is a threat until proven otherwise. Cal Reardon had heard that version his whole life. He had even lived by it for a season. But the afternoon he stepped down from his horse and held the reins out to a girl who was running for her life, he had made a different choice, and what came back to him out of that choice, in the weeks and months that followed, was not the kind of reward that gets counted or displayed, not the kind that makes a story clean and easy to summarize. It was quieter than that, and stranger than that, and more durable than that. It was the knowledge of having acted once in a way that he could look at steadily without flinching, in a moment when it cost him something real, and the outcome was entirely unknown. That is not a small thing. In a territory where most men were spending their lives trying to take as much as they could before something took them, it was, in its own unassuming way, something close to everything. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. More stories from the frontier, where every choice leaves a mark on the land and on the people who had to make it. and tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Cal's place? Would you have stepped down from that horse? We want to hear from you.